a Nissan S13 built in the early 2000s by a now Mazda engineer, documented and covered in the pages of Sports Compact magazine, articles on Motor Trend and Motor IQ. Today, follow me as we cover the build history of a car dubbed Project Silvia. Now, the Nissan S chassis is a chassis synonymous in the world of drifting and the car community as a whole. Me, myself, I've owned two in the past, a hatch and a coupe, a chassis that's now overpriced, in my opinion, difficult to find in good conditions. All of them are probably clapped out, and a chassis that's slowly being replaced by cars like the 350Z, FRS, BRZ, and even Mustangs in some cases. But back in the day, you could find these cars for a dime a dozen. $1,500 would get you a running, clean S13 in the early 2000s, something that's impossible these days. Back in the time before car YouTubers like TJ Hunt, Adam LZ, Randy from Eliminate, and my boy Jimmy Oaks, back before they were documenting their drift builds on YouTube, car enthusiasts didn't have YouTube to go and watch car videos. So what they would do is they would go on car forums like Silvia or Nico Club, or they would jump on the pages of car magazines like Import Tuner, Sports Compact magazine, where these magazines would write full articles on cars, covered cars in Japan, covered car shows in Japan, had a whole catalog of parts you could order from, and even had tech tips on how to work on your own car. Which brings me to today's topic. In this specific issue, May 2002 issue of Sports Compact Car Magazine, there's an article written by a man named Dave Coleman on how to build a Turbo Silvia for $3,000. $3,000 for a Turbo Silvia these days is something that is impossible. A Silvia front end can't even be found for less than $3,000. An original metal front end is not possible. But back in the early 2000s, this was something that was very easily accomplished. Now, this article here is what started a whole series of articles covering Dave's car that he named Project Silvia. Now, the story starts like this. After Dave experienced an SR20 powered Nissan Sentra SCR, a front-wheel drive SR20 SCR that was dubbed the Disco Potato due to its color and its shape, a car that made the Garrett GT 2860 RS famous. That's what that turbo is named after. After experiencing that car, Dave was inspired to build his own SR20 powered Disco Potato car, but this time he wanted to do it in a rear-wheel drive configuration. So Dave's vehicle of choice was a 1989 USDM Nissan 240SX S13 that he got in an original two-tone color, and thus Project Silvia was born. So after swapping in the JDM front end, the car was quickly painted in a flat black color with $50 worth of Krylon spray paint. Now this was due to the car having bad filler job and Bondo showing and a white front left fender, and Dave just could not have it. So he quickly spray painted the car. It was actually inspired by a Cadillac that was parked down the street from Dave's house. Along with the Silvia front end, Dave swapped in an SR20 DET red top with obviously the Disco Potato turbo installed in it, thus completing the challenge of creating a Turbo Silvia for $3,000. Dave paid $800 for the car and $2,100 for the front end along with the SR20. That is insane. You can't even find red top SR20s for that price nowadays. $2,100 got him an entire front clip, including the engine. So after completing the challenge of the $3,000 Turbo Silvia build, Dave couldn't stop there and quickly started modifying Project Silvia. Now, Dave's first target was the suspension. Nowadays, we have companies like GK Tech making an entire front angle kit, an entire rear suspension system for these cars. Back then, that wasn't a thing, so people had to get creative. So after a lot of trial and error, Dave ended up using an S14 front spindle along with the 5-lug hub, and in the rear, Dave used an entire 300ZX knuckle along with the parking brake and the caliper, also with the 5-lug hub. Some JIC Magic coilovers were used all around the car, but the rear had custom mounts to fit the 300ZX knuckle because the mounting points are actually different from the S chassis and the Z chassis. Along with the coilovers, Dave also used some JIC Magic front and rear strut braces, as well as front tension rods, upper control arms, tow rods, and traction rods for the rear. He also used some white line front and rear sway bars to wrap up the entire suspension. Now for the brakes, Dave went with a Brembo Gran Turismo big brake kit to go along with the 300ZX rear calipers that he had. And this was all sitting on some 17 by 7.5 with a 43 offset Bolt CE28 wheel, along with a 5mm spacer to fill in the gap, and wrapped in some 255/45s Falcon Azenis Sports tires. And like I said before, the entire point of this project was to create a rear-wheel drive version of the Sentra Disco Potato, which pushed 280 horsepower to the wheels and ran a 13.7 quarter mile at 104.5 miles per hour, launching it in second gear. Now, while the SR20 in Project Silvia was completely stock internally, some support mods had to be done in order to reach the numbers of the Sentra Disco Potato, so more mods had to be done. For the fuel system, Dave upgraded the stock SR20 380cc fuel injectors to some Nismo 550cc injectors, along with a 300ZX fuel pump. Instead of using a 300ZX MAF, a Ford Cobra MAF was used, using a Jim Wolf Technologies kit to splice it into the stock OEM harness. The battery was also relocated in front of the passenger seat. Dave also used a custom setup to push the intercooler inside the engine bay using some custom pipes, along with an Apexi intercooler with a Greddy Type S blow valve and some red Thermoflex couplers to match the valve cover. The coil radiator with some Flexolite E-fans were used to wrap up the rest of the cooling system. But for the exhaust, Project Silvia had a Greddy downpipe paired with a Landspeed high flow cat and a JIC Magic titanium catback exhaust. That probably sounded sick. The stock ECU was replaced with a ROM tune style ECU by Jim Wolf Technology, but instead of just installing the ROM tune, Dave actually drove the car down to Jim Wolf Technologies in San Diego and had the car tuned in shop by Jim Wolf Technologies themselves. So after all the mods, Project Silvia was pushing 274 horsepower to the wheels on an open diff, only 6 horsepower from its goal to match the Disco Potato Sentra's 280. Now, shortly after all that, Project Silvia found itself in a California drag strip. With ball tires and an open diff, the car ran a 13.4 quarter mile at 109.9 miles per hour, spinning the left rear wheel all the way through first and second gear. After that, Dave was told by his boss to make Project Silvia run 12s or else he'd be fired. So the open diff was quickly swapped out with a quick diff, whatever that is. A new custom clutch by Jim Wolf Technologies using a 300ZX pressure plate and a Jim Wolf clutch were installed, along with new tires all around. After a lot of trials and adjustments to the bleed valve and the tire pressure, along with some nice weather, Project Silvia ran a 12.84 at 111 miles per hour quarter mile with 91 octane pump gas, saving Dave's job. The car ran freaking 12s. But after a couple of track days in the hot California summer, Dave realized that Project Silvia needed a few more upgrades. A complete custom intercooler sprayer using the stock windshield washer pump and some nozzles, and a new vent by cutting the front bumper were made to help get more airflow into the engine and keep those temperatures down. A Greddy oil pan and oil cooler were installed to further help with the hot temps. The car also received a 300ZX Brakemaster cylinder, upgrading it from the stock 7/8 of an inch to a 1 1/16 inch to help with the big brakes from the Brembo kit. After trying out a couple bucket seats, Project Silvia ended up using an R32 GTR stock seat. The JDM 180SX tach-meter was also installed in the digital cluster, bumping the range from the stock 8K to 9K. Now, after a lot of track days, Dave noticed that Project Silvia had some trouble coming out of corners. The problem was that the turbo was either not spooling fast enough or spooling too fast when first and third gear coming out of the corners. The car would either bog out from spooling too slow or would kick in too hard if he dropped down to second gear, causing him to spin out. So in order to fix this issue, he decided to swap the stock S13 head from the SR20 to a better flowing S14 DE head. Now, some custom work had to be done for that S14 head to fit in the DET S13 block. All that custom work ended up taking 18 months. Now, during that time, the engine sat with no head, but Dave sprayed some WD-40 and covered it with duct tape to prevent rust from happening. But rust still happened. So now the block was ruined, covered in rust. So he took the block to get bored and honed. But instead of just a simple head swap now, and the block needing work, it was decided that Project Silvia would receive forged JE pistons along with some K1 technology rods and a full race twin scroll manifold and a twin scroll BorgWarner EFR turbo. Now all this was decided in order to break that 300 horsepower barrier mark that Project Silvia had. So with a new plan, new parts, new head, new block, new turbo, Project Silvia was going to break 300 horsepower, no problem. But then, nothing happened. That's where the article stopped. Dave now had a job at Mazda as an engineer. He was building Miatas, and he was helping Mazda engineer new vehicles such as the Mazda CX, I believe. Project Silvia was now pushed to the side, slowly being forgotten about. The flat black S13 that once graced the pages of magazines and online articles, a car that inspired thousands of S chassis owners in the early 2000s, was now being forgotten about. Now, after a ton of research and investigating, like a total weirdo, I was able to find Dave's Instagram, where he had tons of pictures of Project Silvia, but all the pictures was just a car sitting in his backyard, slowly dying, collecting dust, and actually rusting away from the A-pillar. After years of sitting, rotting away, collecting dust, Dave finally sold the car to a new owner in 2022. Finally, Project Silvia is going to have a new beginning, a new owner willing to take on the old and rusted Project Silvia and bring it back to life. But if we all know something, is that history tends to repeat itself, and boy, did it. Once again, the car was abandoned, left, and forgotten about. The last thing I was able to find about Project Silvia was from the owner, which he posted a video in 2022 shortly after acquiring the car from Dave, showing that he had the car and he was building the SR20 back together to put back in Project Silvia. But that's it. That's where the video stops. Now, I did find him on Instagram as well, and I did try to reach out to him, but as of this day in 2025, I have not heard back from either Dave or the person he sold the car to. Now, please don't try to reach out to these people. I've already done that just to try to get more info, and I don't want these people getting bombarded with messages trying to figure out what happened to the car. But that's it. That's the entire build history and where the car was seen last. Project Silvia was definitely a product of its time, a product of the early 2000s, a time where Fast and the Furious had just came out and hundreds and thousands of people were inspired in either going to the drag strip or street racing, building hot rods, building drift cars, building street cars. A car that inspired anybody that followed the articles on the magazine or even online. A car that intrigued me so much because of one simple article in this magazine that led me down a giant rabbit hole with of articles and pictures, just slowly putting the pictures together to figure out the story of what happened to this car. But that's sadly where the story ends. 3 years ago in 2022, Dave sold the car. The owner posted one video about it, and that's all we heard. We don't know where the car is now. But who remembers this car? Did any of you ever read these articles growing up? Or maybe some older guys that read these articles when they were in their 20s in the early 2000s? Who's a fan of this car now because of this video? Who wants to know where this car is? Because I know I do. So the question is, where is Project Silvia now? Who has it? What's the current state of it? Will we ever see this car again? Who knows? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I do.